we have Professor Louise Haagh. She researches and writes about problems relating to the democratization of human development, economic justice, modalities of institutional change, and social transformation. She also does advocacy work for broader humanist, democratic, and defense of basic income that sets this reform in the context of human development perspectives on freedom and the problem of democratization and the public sphere. You can read more about her on our website at the AA's Financing the Commons, but I'd like to just hand over to Louise and yes, take it away, please, Louise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak today about basic income. So for me, talking about basic income in isolation is somewhat problematic. As you just expressed, I work on much wider issues of economic justice, economic systems, and the relationship between economic systems and humanist justice. But this does take me to the question of the design of the institutions that we live under, the connection between those institutions and how much their design matters for everyday lives of individuals. So it's from that sort of systemic perspective that I'm going to talk about basic income. And I think the last speaker gave me a cue in making a very basic distinction, which I hope people can relate to when you think about basic income. And I should first of all define basic income if you don't know what it is, but in a very, very sort of basic sense, it is the idea that every person should have a right to live unconditionally with a subsistence grant for life. It will be a small subsistence grant, but the idea is to guarantee some sort of level of individual autonomy within modern systems that has perhaps never existed or certainly has been increasingly corroded in the last 40 to 50 years. But my argument really is that a basic income is only a small part. It's a small step in securing civil rights. And I'm going to talk about basic income from a civil rights perspective. So it's very much a question of, for me, democratizing the state, looking at what the state is currently doing in terms of guaranteeing individuals' financial security and what it could be doing differently. And in terms, again, then of the last speaker who spoke about the difference between coordination and cooperation, I think perhaps the most well-known version of basic income has to do with coordination. Is the idea that if everyone has basic needs secured, then everyone can function better in the market system, and the market system itself will function better. And of course, Hayek himself did talk once or twice about a subsistence guarantee, and that's something that he believed in. Milton Friedman also. So these are economic libertarians of a kind who saw a value in something like a basic income. Although in the case of Milton Friedman, it was what he called a negative income tax. So it's really a case of managing every individual's tax account in a way that whenever you fell below a certain income, the state would guarantee that you would receive something just to enable you to survive. And for him, it was very much an anti-paternalist stance, to get the state out of monitoring individuals. But there is another, I think, overlapping in some ways case for basic income, which I'm going to talk about, which is basic income as an institutional right. And that thinking about basic income as an institutional right, I think, gets us much more close to the idea of, on the problem of how you guarantee money in a cooperative sense and what you do with money in a cooperative sense and what you do with rights that enables cooperation when individuals do have rights to financial security. So I'm going to talk, first of all, a little bit around definitions about of the commons and definitions of basic income. And I'm going to argue that the reasons for basic income really matter, or just distinguish between two types of reasons. One, which is that it's a market mechanic sort of institution. Another very different reason is it's part of building democracy and civil society. And whilst there can be overlaps between these two, I also think there's some quite serious differences that we need to acknowledge. And as I've been part of the basic income movement, I'm a skeptical supporter of basic income and in that movement, meaning I support basic income on certain conditions or for certain reasons, but not all reasons and not in all conditions. But there's a tendency in the basic income community, as it were, to sort of emphasize what we all agree on rather than what we might disagree on and how that can matter. And I think that does matter increasingly, that we clarify how basic income fits within different visions of the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different ideas of the commons. Again, I think that's something we ought to disagree about. We ought to sort of clarify that people mean different things about the commons as they do about basic income. And in that context, I'll then talk a little bit about what I call the institutional case for basic income as a civil right. And in relation to that, also point to the insufficiency of basic income, that basic income cannot be funded without a democratic foundation. It can't function very well without other adjacent rights. And it's very important to bear that in mind. But in that very context, I think you can very positively see a basic income as a kind of lever, a pivot that can change strained, tired relationships in the modern economy, these particular relationships between the citizen and the state that become very apparent when people lose income and then have to go and ask for it. And then what are the terms and conditions that are set for individual survival in this context in different countries? And that's something I've looked at in terms of the humanistic idea of economic security and what that ought to look like. And I can certainly say in terms of sanction systems, for example, which I've compared, these are sanctions that can be imposed on people who receive benefits, depending on how they behave or what a work coach thinks that they are thinking or what they are wanting, and whether that fits what that work coach thinks they should be doing or not, etc. And in this context, the relationship has become more and more authoritarian over the last 20, 30 years in all rich states, but in some states much more so than others, which I think makes this institutional case for basic income quite apparent. And last, I'm going to mention what I refer to as a kind of threat of usurpation of basic income into narratives and debates that at least the scholars who talk about basic income in the classical sense never imagined. And so there is a kind of polemical, I think, field of debate about where we're going with this idea nowadays. Okay, so how should we, first of all, define the commons? Because I was asked to talk about basic income as a form of finance of the commons. And that led me to think, well, what do I mean by commons? What do other people mean by commons? What do people in the basic income movement think about our commons? Because again, this talked about a lot in the basic income movement as well. What is the relationship between basic income and commons? And I think I want to outline three visions. And the first two are what I would refer to as visions of alternative publics. So this is that which is not private or public in the common sense. So this is filling spaces that are not filled or expanding spaces that are not recognized. So the first type would be, you have a Marxian life world. This is the idea of a private sphere outside of systems that was very prominent in the 1970s as a form of critique of the post-war welfare state, as being too conforming, as taking up too much of private space. So the idea that there's a need to reinvent community space outside of this conformist, protective welfare state. But I think this notion of an alternative community, of an alternative commons, has become more and more almost mechanically linked with filling gaps where the public sector has failed. So I think this idea of a community that can expand has actually become hollowed out alongside the hollowing out of the public sphere. That you almost need a stronger public sphere in order to have this stronger private sphere. And so there's a slight problem, I think, with this idea, this particular alternative idea. You also have another idea of an alternative public, which I call the ledger. This is much more recent. This is the world of blockchain as a form of community of finance that is more transparent, that governs itself. The last speaker talked about subsidiarity. I think this is very much particular kind of subsidiarity perspective advanced, as was rightly mentioned, by Haagh and others, many economic liberals, who have a very idealistic view of how the economy functions, as opposed to what I'd call a more realistic institutional view of how it actually functions. Also, the last speaker talked about cooperation. I'd say the reality of the economy is that it's a set of institutions, whether you want to recognize that or not. The economy is not this fluid, interactive system that we would like it to be. But I just looked up the definition of a ledger, and I got the AI definition, which I thought was quite indicative of what I want to say. So this is a ledger in cryptocurrency. It's a public record of all transactions on a blockchain. It's a decentralized system that uses a cryptography to keep transactions secure and traceable. So this is kind of a very benign definition of this idea of a ledger alternative sort of community of commons, which I want to, well, I hope maybe in discussion we can sort of look at more critically. But in any case, I think the idea is quite a technocratic vision, which contrasts somewhat with the life world vision, which is a more societal vision. But I would allege that these two visions have become increasingly intertwined, and that this is problematic, because I think actually the life world vision is dependent on public sector, and the more it's become aligned with this more idealistic, which I think is unworkable or unrealistic idea of a finance that polices itself, or that has in itself a kind of accountability, is problematic. And one of the reasons I think it's problematic is the bigger the system is, even if notionally you can look at all of the different transactions, you actually need some kind of structuring of all of that information in order to interpret it and politically discuss it and actually make these systems political and accountable. So I don't think the accountability argument is very good when we're talking about this type of commons. So a third vision would be the more traditional civil society vision, which I would say we can define as successful integration of society into the public sphere. So a kind of public ownership of the state. I did a paper where I compared these sanction systems and just looked at how societies, these were the Nordic societies, where the public owns the state to a greater extent. These sanction systems are much less harsh. I mean, they're still problematic. But it's this idea that where the public owns the state, the public is part of policing what the state does to citizens, and they're part of sort of governing everyday life. And I think I would like to think of the commons in that way, and whether we can recreate that kind of commons. So I wonder, that's the last point in the slide really, whether the first and second type of alternative publics are really a kind of reaction to failure of the public sphere. And if they are, should we go back to actually look at the civil society and the public sphere rather than imagine idealisms on the back of failure? But then let's turn to basic income. So a basic income, standardly defined, has at least these 5 features. One thing that's not mentioned here is lifelong, but which is sort of implicit as well in the basic income. Now, I would say that a basic income has always been classically defined by scholars as a civil right. And this lies in the 5 elements, in all of the quintessence of all of these key elements of basic income, including perhaps the 6th one, that it's a lifelong grant, which emphasize the importance of coverage for all, so that access to grants do not depend on circumstances. Rather, financial security, like healthcare, like the right to vote, is a foundation that is individual and permanent. It can't be redistributed, it can't be negotiated, it can't be taken away. And of course, this is not the case. Finance cannot be taken away, your subsistence cannot be taken away under basic income system. It cannot be the case that you'll need to exhaust all your savings either before you're eligible to a form of support. One of the problems we have with the current benefit systems is all the bureaucratic traps that are linked with them. One of them being what I call injustice to savers, which is that if for no reason or no fault of your own, you're laid off or you're unable to continue working for some reason, it's actually very hard if you have savings to access income support. You have to exhaust all those savings. And I think there's some injustice in that. Whereas with a basic income, you would, there's no means test. So you will have this underlying financial security in place. You cannot be compelled to take a job or a particular job either, on the pain of access to money for basics like food, or be sanctioned through partial or wholesale withdrawal of benefits. So a basic income would solve some, I think, of the coercive aspects of the current way of delivering economic security. And I just remind everyone that there is a question, of course, about the finance of basic income. There's also an argument that basic income is really there to help redistribute and redress inequality. I don't argue that. I argue that insofar as we want to move to a different relationship between state and citizens, it's really about how people access what they already access. We already access a tax-free allowance. We already access a number of goods for free. And a lot of people depend on the state for income. I think that if we change the way that people access financial security, it will release energies that currently are being trapped. We know the Chancellor now is out to cut more disability benefits and so on, but I think she's going to be trapped in a system and mode of doing that that's going to be coercive. Whereas I think with the basic income, there might be other things that you could do than just simply pressure people into the existing labour market. So the institutional case for basic income relies on these sorts of arguments. And I think we have similar proposals in the UK at the moment. They're not called basic income, but they're going in that direction, which I think shows that there's a kind of natural rationale for basic income that has emerged out of the failure of the welfare state and the precarious labour market as well. So, for example, the New Economics Foundation put forward the weekly national allowance, which is £50 per week for anyone earning less than 125,000 K. Now, of course, that violates the universal criterion of basic income. So it's not a full basic income because it's rich tested in this case. But nevertheless, I think the way of financing this proposal is very similar to the Citizens' Income Trust proposal, which I think is slightly problematic in that the way it's modeled it is in terms of current spending without taking into account behavioral changes that could happen or alternative systems that could be slotted in. But the Citizens' Income Trust has calculated the cost to require 3% rise in taxation. I don't think that's necessary. Depends on how you implement it. But the key point is really about the mechanism of how individuals access income. So, as I already mentioned, the institutional case of basic income would then be part of replacing sanction systems and more opportunity-led systems. Current income security design is heavily sanctions and control-based. There's a lot of evidence for negative impacts that this has, and also quite discretionary and problematic ways that these systems are being implemented. If you look at the National Audit Report, National Audit Office report into benefit sanctions of 2016, for example, there's a wealth of examples there. I have written a report together with colleagues in the WHO, World Health Organization, collecting evidence from a range of countries, from experiments also in alternatives, that look at the relationship between the way that you deliver economic security and health outcomes. But there are also more economic arguments in terms of easing poverty and disincentive traps. It's the incentive to take on a full-time job under the current benefit system is very low. You're clawing back benefits, the tax, you have very high tax rates on taking extra work and so on, and actually changing the way in which people receive basic financial security will take some of those disincentives away. If you want to look more at recent writing, there's a very good article by Richard Blondell, who also looks at the problematic trend that is existing in current benefit systems. So it's kind of passively underwriting the precarious wage economy. And so I'd argue for basic income along those lines. But of course, there's also arguments for freeing up people's time, giving people more control over time and their choices, enabling and encouraging bargaining behavior. That's where the subsidiarity argument could come in, I think. And of course, as I mentioned, the basic income would also mean greater justice for savers when they lose their employment. But as I said, I think there's also a case for always being aware of the insufficiency of basic income. And that is, here we have a paradox, because I think in the systems where you need basic income the most are also the systems where it is harder to finance basic income. And it's also systems like the UK, high inequality, precarious economies, where the effects of basic income would at least initially be weaker, although very important. Okay, but one of the reasons that finance is harder is that the UK has never developed shared savings systems in relation to labour market risks, which most European economies have done. And those shared savings funds, they reduce some of the dependencies on tax finance. And one of the reasons why the UK is trapped is because society saves very little. And again, that's part of the precarious employment trend. The UK spends a lot on housing benefits. It's a part of a trend of bailout of the private sector that follows the deregulation of services. That's also very costly to the state. And the third problem is that income benefits are not aligned with education or occupational planning in the UK. Mediation and employment transitions are not skills-led. So if just to give a couple of figures, just to put in context what I'm talking about, you've got the UK here in the red in terms of total tax revenue in OECD amongst other comparative countries in the OECD. Total tax revenue in GDP in the UK is low. Of course, this is not what is said in national debates in the UK. You need to have a sort of comparative, wider perspective to see that. And this is also what you see in the graph there. The Nordic states and the core EU states, their tax rates and GDP are higher. And you, of course, ask yourselves why. But one of the reasons that tax is lower in Britain, there are many reasons. But one of the reasons is you can't tax employment as much as you can in other economies because employment is precarious and you've got wage stagnation. You also have a spending challenge, as I said before. Look at this graph at your leisure. But one of the things that one can notice is the very, very high cost of housing. Housing benefit spending in the UK has increased astronomically compared with the OECD, and linked with that, very low and radically declining spending on training in the UK. So if you look here at what happens in employment transitions for individuals, how much does the UK spend compared with other countries in the OECD on training and on administration in relation to unemployed people? The UK, I think, has the worst ratio in terms of high spending on admin relative to low spending on training and other active measures. So this points to the need that I'm talking about in terms of a switch in the relationships between the state and citizens, less coercion, more investment in opportunities. And I think the basic income is part of that. But just on its own, it may not have the effects that we expect. It may also be more contentious and hard to finance it. So this slide is 2007. Now this is 2014. The UK has disappeared. This raises another issue I think is very important about information. So the UK, under the coalition government, stopped supplying data to the OECD on many indicators and many statistics. And one of them was the labour market, and one of them was investment and training. And so we actually have no monitoring as a civil society of what's going on here. But I can tell you the figures are very bleak, and that's recognised in many reports. So I think probably time to conclude. But in concluding, I just want to revisit these other visions of basic income and the comments that I started with. And I think if we look, first of all, at the idea of a life world today and what would a life world mean today, as I said, I do worry that it is the idea of community is too disconnected from wider agendas about how we might reform the state. And I think we need to think more ambitiously about reclaiming democratic spaces within the state for civil society. And perhaps basic income can be part of that, but not on its own. Coming back to the ledger, we got Elon Musk, of course, very recently has argued for blockchain as a way to make US government more accountable, but also to cut it down. And he's also argued for a universal high income. So not a universal basic income, but high income. And is this what kind of vision of a commons is that? And I think it's, first of all, a contradictory vision, because if you're going to use these neutral impersonal technologies to cut down the state and move accountability into a different space, how stable is the finance for this idea that he has of universal high income? And I think obviously there's a contradiction there. And the other problem, I think, is this idea of universal high income. A, it's not affordable, and B, the reason for it, for someone like Musk, is to sustain consumption, is to sustain our attachment to the global techno companies and other things that we've come to depend on. And I do realize there are other visions of local currencies and blockchain that are smaller. And I think that is a very different thing. But I think, with my experience with alternative currencies, which is obviously slightly different from blockchain, is that these work best in smaller communities when they are attached to real economies. And I do wonder whether we need larger alternative currencies or cryptocurrencies. And I also worry about the idea that we would use the state, as, Donald Trump has just come out and said, I will underwrite, XYZ cryptocurrencies. What does that do to public money? And do we really want public money to be locked up into that? I think that's a real problem. So I think we have to be careful when we think about commons and financing it in terms of blockchain technology. And that does worry me. I think maybe a failure of government is behind these visions. These visions are not necessarily positive. They are desperate in some ways. They respond to our loss of control. So we should not lose sight, if I may conclude, of how strong civil rights, and that is for me universal rights. I haven't had a chance to talk about the fact that basic income itself has become partialized. In other words, the discussion has lost grip on what universal basic income really is, which is civil rights and universal right. And we have instead versions that are very much sort of targeted at different communities, which is a contradiction in terms when you think about what a basic income is supposed to be, which is securing the whole of the community, and therefore community effects you have, that is a whole national political community. So we should not lose sight of how strong civil rights, so that is universal rights, and how such rights are backed by states. And the way that those rights are backed by states create transparencies and stable forms of finance that make those rights last. And in the UK context, I think there's no easy answer. It's a very fragmented landscape that we're facing. I think the challenge must be, though, about how to bring the case for a return to civil rights, to make that a cornerstone for building of a new commons. So we must connect this transformation of the state that a basic income would be part of making, along with other transformations like an emphasis on investing in individuals, education and opportunities, especially when they're down on their luck. And this is important so that these idea of commons are not dependent, do not become dependent on vicarious finance, are not compromised, but are populated with people who have basic rights in common.
Thank you so much.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.